What's up everyone, it's Goose, and I hate sunburns. My dog hates sunburns too. Today we're going to do yet another amp comparison between the Fractal FM9 and the Quad Cortex. And this time it'll be Fractal's Peavey 6160 model, which is their block letter 5150, versus the Quad Cortex's Peavey 505 model, which is also a 5150, kinda. So Fractal models a 5150, Neural models a 6505, and the 6505 is basically a 5150 but without the eddy. In Fractal's documentation between the 5150 and the 6505 models, they found that there are differences in the input components, but they don't affect the tone enough to where it would be even worth it for them to model a different model. The original 5150 block letter is based on a Soldano SLO 100 circuit, which was Eddie's amp before the whole Peavey deal. And the 5150 does sound kind of like an SLO, but it's a little bit warmer. There's a bit more upper mid aggression, so a bit more that cocked wah sound, as well as a resonance knob, which is kind of also like known as a depth knob. And the 5150 has had so many revisions over the years. The 5152 is the same amplifier, but with an extra preamp tube gain stage. The 6505 is just Peavey continuing on the amps without Eddie's name after Eddie took the 5152 Fender for the EVH amps. During this time, a lot of reports about the component quality changed during the time, but the tone, from what I've learned, hasn't really changed too much. Then there's also the 6505 Plus, which is kind of a 5152, and then there's also a 6505 2, which is a 6505 Plus with an updated transformer. I'm looking at my notes right now because I can't remember all of these. There's also a 6534, which is an EL34 model. And there's also a 6505 1992 original, which seeks to update the components to be more close to the original block letter. So you get the picture. There are a lot of revisions. They all have a very similar sound. People will tell you there's huge differences between them. In my personal opinion, if you're A-Bing them, you will hear differences, I think. But the ones we're comparing today, this 5150 block letter and the 6505, should be really, really similar between the Fractal model and the Neural Quad Cortex model. Also, if you like this sort of content, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It greatly helps out my channel. So Fractal and Neural both model the lead and crunch channels. For these comparisons, both will be running the same settings that you'll see on screen. We're going to start with the lead channel this time. The lead channel between the two is very, very similar, and we'll be putting a boost in front for high gain riffs for that channel. On the crunch channel, we're going to explore some non-boosted sort of mid-gain tones. And I wanted to do that 1 second because that one differs actually quite a bit. We'll also be doing the volume test on that crunch channel to see how well the amp models respond to rolling down your guitar's volume knob. For the guitar, we're going to be using my Kiesel Solo. This has a DiMarzio illuminator in the bridge, and we're solely going to be using that pickup. And the IR we're going to be using is from the Ownhammer Rock Box, and it'll be the Modern 2 mix of the 2018 8-ohm V30s. All right, so let's start with high gain because these are really, really close. All right, so these are very close. As always, once you control for the IRs between all these modeling units, you actually end up with a very similar sound between all of them. And they're so close that you would actually think that the specific amp that they're modeling just might have some slight component variations. Like tolerances on analog equipment is just vast and actually can make a big difference in the amp tone. If I were to have to nitpick, I would say that the QC has slightly more gain in this one, and it's just a tad slower in response, so like it feels a little bit saggier. And it's not a bad thing actually, because that actually might make the quad Cortex version a little bit more forgiving. But I think in terms of the feel, they're actually a little different. I don't know how to describe it. It's really hard to get across the idea of feel through sound demos. The quad Cortex model is a lot more compressed feeling under the fingers and a lot squishier in my opinion. And then the Fractal is a bit more open and big sounding and feeling under the fingers as well. As always with Fractal, you can just adjust the backend settings in order to make it a bit more like the quad Cortex version if you really want. But I actually kind of also like how it sounds stock. And I didn't want to mess with any settings that the QC didn't have in its amp model, so I think this is a more fair comparison. And overall, I think both of them sound great for this. If you like the lead channel sound from the block letter amplifier, both of these will do well. All right, so heading into unboosted mid-gain tones. I want to preface this with saying that typically in these comparisons, I try to figure out what the best part of each amp model is if there are major differences. Because even if I might like one better than the other one might have more use for a different kind of player than me. So I try to go at it from different perspectives, whether it be amps, pedals, any other effects, etc. But in this case, I honestly have to say, one of them is just bad. I'll let y'all hear them first, and I'll let y'all decide on what you like and what you don't like, of course, and I'll give you my thoughts afterwards. They're running the same settings as the lead channel, and I did this because the actual amp itself only has shared EQ, and the only differences between the two, as with also on the real amp, you have separate dials for gain and volume, so I have the gain set differently and as well as the master set differently because I felt like the master needed a little bit more push for the crunch channel. We'll also do the volume test as well, where I roll down the guitar volume knob to see how well the amp model cleans up with the volume knob turned down. So let's go. All right, so my thoughts. I really don't like the QC version. All the settings are the same between the two. With that, it was just bloated. It was really unclear with the individual note separation as well. And even though there was slightly less gain on the Quad Cortex model, it sounded more cocked wah, which is not a great sound without a lot of gain, in my opinion. Like, one of the reasons why people like the EVH 5150s, even though they do have that cocked wah sort of honk, is because there actually is enough gain to make that sound cutting through the mix. I actually tried changing the settings a little bit, and I found one that was a little bit better. All right, so these are my alternate settings. Basically, the main difference is I pulled the bass and the depth down so that I could kind of clear that congestion that I was getting from the settings that I had matched with the Fractal. The distortion sounds fine in my opinion, and pulling the bass and depth down really kind of got rid of that congestion. I'm still having this like weird MIDI sort of honkiness to it, and that is a 5150 character, but I don't think to this degree in my opinion. But the problem is, if you were to remove the mid to try to kind of compensate for that honk, you start to kind of lose the individual weight of the notes. Any more bass or depth than this, and you run into that weird congested, almost neck pickup sounding like feel that I just don't think is indicative of like the actual crunch channel of the amp. But I hate talking about that in that way. Maybe some of you actually like the tones that came out of that. Maybe some people were playing more of that 80s kind of sound that does use a lot of that cocked wah. Maybe you do like it. But on the flip side of all this, I think the 5150 model in the Fractal might be one of my favorite amp models ever. I enjoy hearing other people play 5150s, especially through the lead channel, but I've never liked playing them myself because of kind of the feel of them. Neither on the red or blue channels on the EVH versions of it, or the lead channels on the original Peaveys. But I've never had the foresight to use a crunch channel when I had the chance on a 5150. I just went straight to lead, so I never really got to experience it. So I'm actually kicking myself now for not having discovered this model in the Fractal earlier. It's so good, and the way that it's set up, I can actually just push it into high gain, like kind of metal territory with a boost, and still have that same kind of low end that 5150 has on the lead channel. And in my opinion, the gain just has a little bit more balanced saturation in it than any of the other 5150 channels I've tried. And even with the volume test, it cleaned up really, really well compared to the Quad Cortex. And I'm going to keep raving about this model if y'all let me, and I don't want to make this video too long. But kind of a slight tangent to that though, this is one of the earlier models, I believe. And I don't know how often Fractal has updated this specific model, but Fractal has made an effort to update their existing models on their units, at least for the newer units. To that end, I hope Quad Cortex updates the rhythm channel on their Peavey 505. I think the lead channel on the Quad Cortex does match the Fractal super well. You could take either of them and be super happy with them. And I know Neural has been working on trying to get their plugins onto the Quad Cortex, so this is probably not a super high priority for them. And I'm excited for that because I want the Soldano plugin to be available in the Quad Cortex, because I quite like the Soldano plugin a little bit more than the Solo model on the Quad Cortex. And now having the Quad Cortex for a few weeks at this point, I think it's been like almost 2 months. It would be awesome to see Neural update their more mid-gain amp models. So I've heard complaints about their JCM 800 model on the Quad Cortex as well. And like I said, I didn't like the rhythm model for their 5150 or 6505 or whatever. And considering that they do have great high gain models, this is really more of a just bringing everything else to that same level of quality that I know that the Quad Cortex can do. And again, Fractal does that constantly with their amp models. So it is inevitable, in my opinion, that those will eventually be updated. I don't know if it'll be for the Quad Cortex, maybe a Quad Cortex 2, but hopefully those get updated. And I could dive into that a bit more, but that would be a completely different video. Anyway, what did y'all think? Leave your comments down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed the content here, and I'll catch y'all in the next one. Later.